To be born a Gilded Age heiress was to inherit a contract you had never read. The clauses were unwritten. The husband took the mistresses, the family took the principal, the European title took the dowry, the wife took the silence. 3 women refused. Alva Vanderbilt in 1895, Anna Gould in 1906, Consuelo Vanderbilt in 1921. They walked into open courtrooms in New York, in Paris, and in London. They named the men, they named the money, and in doing so, they broke open a private contract that had quietly governed millions of women's lives for a century. If you have ever wondered what it actually cost to leave a Gilded Age marriage, stay with me. Subscribe so you do not miss the next story of the people the polite history books left out. Chapter 1. The Ball That Forced. Caroline Astor de Bow. On the 26th of March, 1883, Alva Vanderbilt threw a costume ball designed to humiliate the Queen of New York society into receiving her. 1,200 guests, 8 quadrilles. A single sheet of yellow and white satin embroidered with gold thread, worn by the hostess, who appeared as a Venetian Renaissance princess with real diamonds at her throat and in her hair. The cost was reported the next morning at $250,000. In a city where a competent bank clerk earned $800 a year, the figure was not a number. It was a statement. The statement was directed at one woman. Her name was Caroline Schermerhorn Astor. She lived inside the closed register of New York society like a queen inside a small kingdom. Her ballroom on Fifth Avenue could hold 400 guests, and that capacity had become, in the language of the city's columns, the 400. To be inside it was to exist. To be outside, it was to be a stranger in your own town. Caroline Astor had not called on Alva Vanderbilt. Alva had married, in 1875, into the Vanderbilt Railroad fortune. But the Vanderbilts were new money, 3 generations away from a ferryman on Staten Island, and Caroline Astor had not forgiven the family for that origin. Alva understood the social calendar the way a general understands a topographic map. She had commissioned the architect, Richard Morris Hunt, to build her a chateau at 660 Fifth Avenue, a French Renaissance pile of carved limestone and steep roofs that had cost $3 million by the time the door knockers were finished. She invited every prominent family in New York to her ball. She invited Caroline Astor's daughter, Carrie. She did not invite Caroline Astor. The reason, which she allowed to leak quietly through the columns, was that she could not invite the daughter of a woman who had not called on her. A call required a returned card. Caroline Astor had never sent a card. Therefore, the daughter, by the iron logic of the system, could not come to the ball. Carrie Astor wanted to come to the ball. Her mother surrendered. A footman in Astor livery was sent up Fifth Avenue with a calling card on a silver tray. Caroline Astor's name was written on the card in steel point script. The card was received. Alva returned the call within the hour. From that day, Alva was inside the 400. From that day, Caroline Astor's monopoly on social authority in New York was over. The ball that night was, in its formal program, a tribute to the costumes and the dances of pre-revolutionary Europe. In its real meaning, it was the announcement of a new generation. 8 quadrilles, each rehearsed for weeks, paraded through the great rooms. The Star Quadrille, the Hobby Horse Quadrille, the Mother Goose Quadrille, the Dresden Quadrille, Cornelius Vanderbilt. The second danced. So did William Backhouse Astor Jr. So did Caroline Astor's daughter Carrie, in a sapphire blue gown, having achieved her invitation at the cost of her mother's authority. If you are watching this and you imagine that the moral of the story is that Alva Vanderbilt was a status climber, you are missing the lesson. The lesson, learned by everyone who paid attention that spring, was that the rules of Gilded Age society were enforceable only when the most powerful family refused to break them. Alva had simply refused. She had used $3 million of chateau and $250,000 of ball to make refusal look like inevitability. And once she had done it to Caroline Astor, the next person she would do it to was her own husband. There is a photograph of Alva from that year. She is dressed for the ball. The diamonds glitter. The posture is upright. The expression is composed. She does not smile. The face says, in the formal language of the era, that she has decided what she will do next, and she intends to do it whether you approve or not. 12 years later, she would file a divorce petition that fit on a single sheet of paper. The same woman, the same look, the same plan. Chapter 2. The Husband Who Could Not Stay Faithful. William Kissam. Vanderbilt was a quiet man with steady habits, and one of them was a series of mistresses he never bothered to hide. He had been a quiet boy. He had become a quiet man. He liked horses and boats and the company of women who were not his wife. He was the second son of William Henry Vanderbilt, the patient and conservative manager of the New York Central Railroad. His personal fortune in the early 1890s was estimated at $55 million. He was, by any objective measure, one of the 10 richest men in the United States. He was also, by every account that survives in the family correspondence, profoundly bored by the work of being married. The marriage had begun well enough in 1875 at Calvary Episcopal Church on 21st Street. The bride was 22, the groom was 26. The wedding was reported in the New York Times the next day with the standard list of attendants and the standard description of the bride's gown. The early years of the marriage produced 3 children. Consuelo, born in 1877, William Kissam II, born in 1878, Harold Sterling, born in 1884. The family wintered on Fifth Avenue and summered at Idle Hour on Long Island and at Marble House in Newport, the $11 million marble cottage William had given Alva for her 39th birthday in 1892. The mistresses began early and never stopped. In the social columns, they were referred to by initials, by occupations, by the names of the cities where William kept them. There was an actress in New York. There was a young woman in Newport. There was, by the early 1890s, a woman in Paris. Her name was Nellie Neustretter. She was an American demi-mondaine, living in a tasteful apartment in the 8th arrondissement. William had installed her there at his own expense. He had also been seen with her at Maxime's, at Longchamp, at the Opera. The Paris correspondent of the New York Herald wrote the story up in 1894. The story crossed the Atlantic with the next steamer. Alva read the column. The matter of William's mistresses was not new. The matter of his American mistress kept in Paris at his expense, with his presence documented in the public restaurants, was new. The new element was not the sex. The new element was the publicity. In the unwritten contract of Gilded Age marriage, the husband's affairs were permitted only on condition that they remain invisible. William had broken that clause. Once it was broken, Alva had a choice. She could pretend not to have seen the column, or she could begin the long, careful work of building a case in court. She chose the second. She hired Pinkerton detectives in October 1894. The instructions, which survive in fragments in the Vanderbilt papers at Yale, were precise. Document the Paris apartment, document the restaurants, document the dates, document the witnesses who would testify. She did not want gossip. She wanted evidence that would survive a New York judge's reading. The legal point mattered more than people understand today. In the New York of 1894, divorce was available only on the documented ground of adultery. Cruelty was not a ground. Incompatibility was not a ground. Long absence was not a ground. The petitioner had to produce evidence of a specific act of marital infidelity. If the evidence held, the divorce was clean. The financial settlement followed the divorce. If the evidence did not hold, the case collapsed and the wife was destroyed. Alva understood the system, the way she had understood Caroline Astor's calling cards. She did not move until the evidence was complete. By February 1895, the Pinkertons had delivered. There were dates, places, named witnesses willing to testify under oath. There was a sworn affidavit from a New York attorney who had handled some of William's payments. There were copies of the letters William had written to Nellie Neustretter, recovered by means the lawyers preferred not to put in writing. The cost of staying versus the cost of leaving was now mathematically clear. Staying meant a continuing public humiliation in the era's society columns. Staying meant her 3 children growing up under the daily knowledge that their father lived openly with other women. Staying meant losing her social authority, the authority she had spent 12 years building since the ball, because in the slow chemistry of society opinion, the wronged wife who tolerated her husband eventually became the wife who deserved it. Leaving, by contrast, meant scandal in the short term, custody of the children if she fought for it, and the largest divorce settlement in the history of the United States if her attorneys could draft the petition correctly. She made the decision in mid-February. She told her sister. she told her attorneys. She did not tell her husband until the petition was already drafted and signed. There is a story, possibly apocryphal but consistent with every other documented Alva story, that she announced the decision to William over breakfast at the Fifth Avenue house. He set down his cup of coffee. He looked at her. He asked whether the decision was final. She said it was. He nodded. He went to his club for the day. He did not contest the divorce. Chapter 3. The Filing That Broke a Marriage in 8 Lines. On the 5th of March, 1895, Alva Vanderbilt filed a divorce petition, so short it fit on one sheet of paper. The text was 8 lines long. It named the husband. It named the ground, which was adultery. It named the property at issue, which was the marital estate. It asked for custody of the 3 children of the marriage. It was signed by the petitioner's attorney, by the petitioner's witness, and by the petitioner. The clerk of the Court of Common Pleas of New York County stamped the date. The clerk noted the case number. The petition was filed. The brevity was strategic. A long petition would have invited public scrutiny of every charge. The 8-line petition presented the court with a documented allegation of adultery and asked, in the most neutral language possible, for the standard remedy. The supporting evidence was held in sealed exhibits to be opened only by the judge. The Pinkerton reports, the letters, the witness affidavits all sat behind that one sheet of paper. The New York Times reported the filing on the morning of the 6th of March. The columns of the World, the Herald, and the Sun followed within hours. The story was the lead story of the city for 10 days. The reporters did not have access to the sealed exhibits, but they could see the parties and the attorneys, and they could see that William Vanderbilt was not contesting the petition. From this, they correctly inferred that the evidence in the sealed exhibits was overwhelming. The hearing was set for the 11th of March in front of Judge Charles A. Andrews. It was a private hearing. The room was cleared of reporters. The exhibits were opened. The judge read the Pinkerton reports. He heard the testimony of one witness in a closed session. He noted on the record that William Vanderbilt, through counsel, had filed no answer denying the allegations. He took the case under advisement. On the 18th of March, 1895, 13 days after Alva had filed, Judge Andrews granted the divorce. The decree named Alva as the prevailing party. It granted custody of all 3 children to her. It declared the marriage dissolved on the documented ground of adultery. It permitted the petitioner to remarry. It restrained the respondent from any future claim against the petitioner's property. The financial settlement was negotiated separately from the decree. Newspapers at the time estimated the cash settlement at $2 million on the low end and $10 million on the high end. The Vanderbilt family treated the actual figure as a private matter. Later disclosures, including statements made decades afterward by family members and by Alva's own staff, support a figure at the upper end of the range. Adjusted into modern terms, that figure crosses $300 million. Alva also retained the lifetime use of Marble House in Newport, the $11 million marble palace that William had given her 3 years earlier as a 39th birthday gift. She retained substantial cash and securities held in her own name. She received custody of the 3 children and the responsibility for their education. By any reasonable accounting, on the day the decree was entered, Alva Vanderbilt became the wealthiest divorced woman in the history of the United States. The reaction in New York society was immediate and fierce. Caroline Astor was reported to have refused at first to receive a divorced woman. Alva refused to retreat into the standard mourning clothes a divorced woman was expected to wear that season. She did not withdraw to Europe, the second standard response. She moved with her children to Marble House in Newport for the summer season. She entertained at Marble House. She invited the Queen of England's grandniece. She remained in formal society dress. She wore the diamonds. She did not on any day apologize. The summer season of 1895 at Newport was an experiment. Could a divorced woman of 42, the wealthiest in America, survive socially in the most exclusive resort in the country? The columns watched. The hostesses watched. The bachelors watched. Alva won the experiment by a margin that surprised everyone. She survived. She did better than survive. By August, she had announced the engagement of her 18-year-old daughter Consuelo to the 9th Duke of Marlborough. The most spectacular transatlantic match of the decade was being negotiated by a divorced mother of 3 at a Newport cottage. Caroline Astor's refusal to receive her had quietly evaporated. The new generation had decided. Less than a year after the divorce, on the 11th of January, 1896, Alva married Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, the wealthy banker, in a small private ceremony at Belle Court, his Newport house. She had moved from one of the great fortunes of the United States to another in 11 months. She had brought her children with her. She had kept Marble House. She had taken Belmont's name. The social rule that said a divorced woman was finished had been rewritten by a single woman with a one-sheet petition, sealed exhibits, and the courage to host a ball where her enemies could see her smile. Chapter 4. The Plain Heiress. Nobody took seriously. Anna Gould was not beautiful, and the men around her never let her forget it. She had been born on the 5th of June, 1875, the youngest daughter of Jay Gould, the railroad financier and stock market manipulator who was, by his death in 1892, one of the most hated and one of the richest men in the United States. Anna's childhood was spent at Lyndhurst, the family estate on the Hudson, in a Gothic stone mansion that Jay Gould had bought from the widow of a previous owner, and filled with a private library, an orchid house, and the silences of a man who trusted very few people. Her father had died on the 2nd of December, 1892, of tuberculosis at the age of 56. He left a fortune estimated at $77 million, divided among his 6 children inside a complex family trust. Anna's share was approximately $15 million. Adjusted into modern terms, her personal inheritance crossed $500 million before her wedding day. The family attorneys, led by George Gould, Anna's older brother, were paid to keep the principal intact. In the social columns of New York, Anna was described, in the polite circular language of the era, as not handsome. She was short. She was dark. She wore round glasses for reading. Her hair was carefully arranged but never beautiful. She had a quiet, intelligent face. She did not speak in the practiced society manner of girls trained by their mothers for a season at Newport. The Gould money was new, in a way the Vanderbilt money was no longer new. New York society had received the Goulds, but with reservations. Anna did the season in New York in 1894 with the expected number of dinners. She did the Newport season in the summer of that year. She had no romantic prospects she found interesting. She was 20 years old, and she had been told her whole adult life that her father's reputation would weigh on every man who considered her. In the autumn of 1894, her sister Helen Gould suggested a season abroad in Paris. The Paris of 1894 was, for an American heiress, a particular kind of market. The dollar princess trade was at its peak. Between 1870 and 1914, an estimated $225 million would transfer from American heiress families into European aristocratic families. The brokers worked through the great hostesses, through the introductions at the Ritz, through the gambling tables at Monte Carlo. The system was not random. There were marriageable European titles, there were available American dollars, and there were people whose business was to make the introductions. It was through this system that, in the early winter of 1895, Anna Gould met Count Boniface de Castellane. He was 27 years old. He was the eldest son of an authentic French noble family. He was tall, thin, fair, and known in the salons as one of the wittiest young men in Paris. He was also, openly and across the city, a man whose lovers included both women and men. He was, by his own accounts, charmingly broke. He owed approximately 1 million francs to Paris tailors, jewelers, and moneylenders. Boni de Castellane saw in Anna Gould what he had been told to look for. He saw an heiress whose father had recently died, whose share of the estate was approximately $15 million, whose mother was dead, whose elder brother was likely to negotiate the wedding contract from the position of a relieved trustee. He saw, in addition, a young woman whose ordinary looks and quiet manner suggested she would be grateful. He was, on this last point, profoundly wrong. The courtship moved fast. By February 1895, they were engaged. By the 4th of March, 1895, the same week Alva Vanderbilt was preparing her divorce petition in New York, Anna Gould was married to the Count at the Gould family townhouse at 579 Fifth Avenue. The ceremony was Episcopal because the Gould family did not convert. The wedding presents from the French side were modest. The presents from the American side filled 3 rooms. The settlement, negotiated by George Gould, gave the Count a fixed annual allowance and protected the principle of Anna's inheritance inside her family trust. The structure was clever. The protection was not enough. The couple sailed for France the same week. The Paris papers covered the arrival. Le Figaro described Anna as la jeune américaine, the young American. The Count was photographed at the harbor kissing her hand. Within 6 months, they had taken a Paris house and begun the construction of the building that would become the most spectacular monument to a Gilded Age marriage and the most efficient instrument for spending an heiress's money in the history of Europe. You may find yourself, watching this, asking why Anna did not see the trap. The truthful answer is that she did. The family correspondence shows she suspected, early, that Boni had married her for money. She had decided, before the wedding, that even so, the marriage was worth attempting. She was 20. She had been told her whole life that no European with a title would want her. She was wrong about that. What she did not know, in March 1895, was how fast he could spend, and how quickly the joke about her face would become a public sport in Paris drawing rooms. Chapter 5. The Pink Marble Mansion, built to bleed her dry. Boni de Castellane built his wife a palace on the Avenue Foch that was, by design, a furnace for her father's money. The architect was Ernest Sanson. The site was on the eastern side of the Avenue Foch, the broad boulevard that the recently widened Bois de Boulogne approached at the western edge of Paris. The model was the Grand Trianon at Versailles. The exterior was pink marble. The interior, when finished in 1899, contained more than 30 rooms across 3 floors. A private theater, a winter garden, and a circular staircase modeled on the Great Staircase at the Paris Opera. The construction cost approximately $3 million between 1896 and 1899. The site costed an additional $800,000. The furnishings, mostly antiques bought through Paris dealers, eventually exceeded the construction. The Palais Rose was named, in the polite Paris papers, Le Palais Rose, the Pink Palace. Behind closed doors it was named, by Anna's American attorneys, the Bonfire. The construction was Boni's design. The bills were paid out of Anna's trust on Boni's instructions, executed by Paris bankers who relied on the seal of the Count's office and on the periodic reluctant signatures of Anna herself. The structure of the trust, designed by George Gould in 1894, was intended to prevent exactly this transfer. It failed because Anna, in the early years, signed the checks her husband presented. She would later say in her divorce testimony that she signed in order to keep peace in the house. She would also say that the peace had not been kept. The housewarming was held in 2 phases in the spring of 1902. The first evening was a reception for 1,500 guests, including the Duchesse de Guzet, the Comte de Greffule, the British ambassador, and a contingent of New York society visitors led by Mamie Fish. The second night was a fancy dress ball for an additional 1,400 guests. The gardens were lit with 20,000 electric bulbs, an extravagance considered remarkable in a city that had not yet wired most of its private homes. A live orchestra played in the gardens. A second orchestra played in the Great Hall. The cost of the 2 nights together, according to a Paris Society columnist who saw the household accounts, was approximately $400,000. The press called it the most expensive private party in Paris since the fall of the Second Empire in 1870. Anna stood beside Boni in the receiving line on both nights. She wore diamonds. She wore the pearls her father had left her in the trust. She smiled when introductions required a smile. The columns described her as the discreet hostess. The same columns, the next week, in different sections, returned to the running joke about her face. Boni did nothing to stop the joke. He was reported in private to have made it himself in his clubs. Through the late 1890s and the early 1900s, Boni de Castellane's spending followed the pattern that the architecture had announced. He kept a personal stable of more than 30 horses. He maintained a private orchestra in addition to the orchestras hired for evenings. He bought paintings, books, and antique furniture at a rate that exceeded his stated allowance from Anna's trust by a factor of 5. He gave parties at the Palais Rose and at the Château de Marais near Paris. He kept lovers in apartments across the city and traveled with them to the Riviera in the off-season. The bills moved through a circle of Paris suppliers who understood that the checks were Vanderbilt-level checks. The tailors did not press for payment. The wine merchants extended credit. The antique dealers offered exclusive previews. The system carried Boni for years. The system also produced documentation that, when Anna's attorney subpoenaed it in 1906, would form the basis of the divorce. The two surviving sons of the marriage were Boniface Marie Louis, born in 1897, and Georges-Yves Marie, born in 1901. Both were raised mostly by Anna and by an English governess. Boni saw the children at scheduled hours during the week and at the formal Sunday luncheons. He was not, by the testimony of the servants, a cruel father. He was an absent one. He preferred the company of his Paris friends to the company of his sons. By 1903, Anna's trust had transferred, in cumulative payments, approximately $8 million to or through Boni's spending. By 1905, the figure had crossed $10 million. Adjusted into modern terms, the spending exceeded $300 million. The principal of her father's inheritance had not been touched because the trust structure protected it, but the income from the principal had been entirely consumed, and Boni was now borrowing against the next 10 years of income at rates that would have ruined any ordinary family. The Paris papers reported the parties. They did not report the borrowing. The American papers reported neither. Anna, in the surviving letters she wrote to her brother George in those years, described her husband as a brilliant child. She said the marriage had become a kind of supervised arrangement in which her job was to refuse the largest of the checks and to sign the smaller ones. She also said, in one letter dated June 1905, that she would not be able to refuse much longer. The letter is one of the most cited documents in the historiography of Gilded Age divorce. Chapter 6. The loans that made her pick up the phone. When Boni de Castellane started borrowing against Anna's income at usurious rates, her American attorneys finally wrote to her in plain language. The borrowing began in early 1904. It accelerated through 1905. By the winter of that year, Boni had taken on approximately 4 million francs in personal debt, at interest rates between 12 and 15% annually, from 3 Paris banks and from one Hungarian moneylender working through a Paris intermediary. The collateral was Anna's expected income from the Gould Trust. The legal status of the collateral was murky. The banks, in their correspondence, treated the debt as guaranteed by the Count's marriage. The Gould attorneys in New York did not. The letters from the Paris banks reached the offices of Cravath Henderson de Gersdorff at 37 Wall Street in February 1906. Paul Cravath, who handled the Gould family business, read them on a Tuesday afternoon. The senior partner immediately drafted a telegram to George Gould. The telegram, decoded into plain English, said that the Count's debts now exceeded the next 4 years of Anna's income, that the Paris banks were preparing to file claims against the trust itself, and that the principal of the Gould fortune was, for the first time, exposed. George Gould wrote to his sister the same week. The letter was not affectionate. It described in numbers the trajectory of Boni's spending. It asked whether she had been aware of the borrowing. It asked what she intended to do. Anna received the letter in Paris on the 14th of February. She replied on the 17th. The reply, 3 pages long in her own handwriting, said that she had been aware of some of the borrowing, but not the scale. It said that she had decided, after long consideration, to begin proceedings to end the marriage. It said that she would need the firm of Cravath Henderson de Gersdorff to coordinate with French counsel in Paris immediately. She filed in Paris on the 2nd of March, 1906. The French legal system did not treat divorce as routine. Under the law of 1884, divorce in France required proof of specific causes, including adultery, conviction of a crime, or grave injury. Anna's French attorneys, led by Maître Henri Robert, the most prominent divorce specialist in Paris, decided to proceed on the ground of grave injury, supported by extensive documentation of Boni's lovers, his squandering of the Gould money, and his open mockery of his wife in Paris society. The documentation was extraordinary. Detectives hired by Cravath had been quietly observing the Count for 15 months. They had documented Boni's relationships with at least 2 named female lovers and at least 1 male lover in Paris. They had documented his presence at private dinners, where he had described his wife in language that, when read aloud in court, made the judges flinch. They had documented the bank correspondence, the moneylender contracts, and the personal accounts of his suppliers. They had also documented the Palais Rose itself, room by room, with valuations of the furniture, the paintings, and the household effects. The hearing began on the 18th of March, 1906, before the Tribunal Civil de la Seine. Anna did not testify in person. The French system did not require it. Maître Robert led the evidence. The exhibits were extensive enough that the proceedings consumed parts of 9 separate sessions. The Paris papers covered it daily. The most damaging testimony came from a young woman who had been one of Boni's mistresses during the construction of the Palais Rose. She testified that the Count had instructed her to keep the affair secret only from creditors, not from his wife, because his wife had stopped caring and his creditors had not. The judgment was delivered on the 2nd of August, 1906. The court found in Anna's favor on the ground of grave injury. The marriage was dissolved. Anna was granted custody of the 2 sons. The court ordered Boni to pay damages, which he could not pay, and confirmed Anna's right to recover from the marital estate the value of the personal property she had brought into the marriage. The decision was front-page news on both sides of the Atlantic. The cost to Anna had been measured in 11 years of marriage, $10 million of her father's money spent, and the embarrassment of a public trial in which her husband's private life had been read aloud to a room of journalists. The cost to Boni had been measured in his removal from the Castellane family inheritance, his social ruin in conservative Paris circles, and the loss of access to the Palais Rose, which had been built with money he no longer controlled. The pink marble mansion had been finished in 1899. By August 1906, it stood empty for several weeks, while the bailiffs catalogued the furniture. Anna lived for the next 2 years in Paris hotels, in part to give the Palais Rose's contents time to be valued, and partly to consult quietly with her family in New York. In November 1908, she married Prince Hélie de Talleyrand-Périgord, the Duke of Sagon. The Duke was Boni's own first cousin. The marriage was a deliberate humiliation, calibrated to place Anna, formally and forever, above her former husband in the strict hierarchy of the Almanach de Gotha. The Talleyrand-Périgord family was older, more senior, and richer in titles than the Castellane line. Anna was now a duchess in her own right. Boni, in his Paris clubs, was reduced to a man whose ex-wife had married up. Chapter 7. The Bride Who Cried Through Her Own Wedding. On the 6th of November, 1895, Consuelo Vanderbilt walked down the aisle of St. Thomas Episcopal Church with tears running down her face behind her veil. She was 18 years old. She was 6 feet tall. She had been engaged for most of the previous year to Winthrop Rutherford, a New York gentleman of an old Knickerbocker family who was in love with her and whom she was in love with. The engagement had been broken in the early summer at her mother's order. The replacement engagement had been negotiated with Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, at Marble House in Newport during August. By November, Consuelo was being married to a man she had met only 6 times, who needed her money to repair the roof of Blenheim Palace, who had confessed to her, on the way to the altar, that he was in love with another woman. The story of the locked room, told decades later by Consuelo herself in her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, was simple. She had refused Marlborough. Alva had told her she would shoot Winthrop Rutherford if Consuelo continued to refuse. Consuelo had not believed the threat. Alva had then locked her in her bedroom at Marble House until Consuelo agreed to the engagement. The detail of the locked room was not in dispute. It was confirmed in 1926 in sworn testimony for the Roman Catholic annulment by Consuelo, by her former lady's maid, and by Alva herself, who chose in her late 70s to ratify the account in writing. The wedding contract was extensive. It was negotiated between William K. Vanderbilt's attorneys in New York and the Duke's attorneys in London. The principal element was a transfer of $2,500,000 in shares of the Beech Creek Railway Company, payable to the Duke or to his trustees on the wedding day. The shares carried a guaranteed minimum annual dividend of $100,000 for the Duke during his lifetime, with continuing obligations on the railway company. In modern terms, the principal alone exceeded $90 million. The dividend stream over the Duke's lifetime exceeded a further $100 million. The contract also obligated William K. Vanderbilt to fund the immediate repairs of Blenheim Palace, an additional commitment that within 5 years would absorb another $2 million. The wedding itself was conducted on a scale calibrated to make the contract look like a love match. St. Thomas Episcopal Church on East 53rd Street had been redecorated for the day at a cost reported at $100,000. 8 bridesmaids stood at the altar in white satin with pink ostrich feathers. The bride's gown was white satin with a 15-foot train. The lace was from the Vanderbilt family collection. She wore 3 strands of pearls said to have once belonged to Catherine the Great of Russia, an attribution that survived in the family for decades and that historians now treat with caution. Outside the church, a crowd of approximately 25,000 New Yorkers had gathered. 300 uniformed police were deployed by the city to hold the lines. The crowd cheered when the carriages arrived. They cheered when the bride emerged. They did not see her face, which was covered by the veil, and which, the ladies' maids reported afterwards, was wet with tears. The bridegroom arrived at the church with his best man, the Count Hugh Lonsdale, and waited at the altar with the practiced patience of a man who had spent 6 months negotiating the contract that was about to come into force. The reception was held at the Vanderbilt house at 660 Fifth Avenue, the Petit Chateau Alva had built 12 years earlier, and which she had retained in the divorce settlement. The wedding party consumed 18 courses. The orchestra played in the Great Hall, the Astors attended, the Whitneys attended. Caroline Astor, whose mother had been forced to call on Alva 12 years earlier, attended. The diplomatic corps attended. You may notice that almost every detail of the wedding day was, in fact, a transaction. The contract was a transaction. The lace was a display. The crowd outside was an audience. The cheers were a market reaction. The bride's tears, hidden by the veil, were the only authentic emotion present, and they had no role in the contract. By the end of the reception, Consuelo had been moved through every necessary social position. She had been kissed by her father, William, by her mother, Alva, by her new husband, by the prominent guests. She had received the formal congratulations of the church. She had signed the marriage register. She had, in the language of the Gilded Age, become the Duchess of Marlborough. She was 18 years old. She had been a wife for less than 4 hours. She was about to leave for England on the family steamer in 3 weeks, with 2 stewards, 3 maids, and the wedding contract enacted. Chapter 8. The Cold Marriage at Blenheim Palace. The Duke confessed on the honeymoon that he was in love with another woman, and the marriage never recovered. The other woman was, the Duke explained over breakfast on the train south through France, a young woman in Northamptonshire to whom he had attached himself emotionally several years earlier. The Duke had ended that relationship, he said, in order to marry Consuelo. He felt, he said, that Consuelo deserved to know. He felt no obligation to discuss the matter further. He intended to fulfill his contractual duties as a husband. The contractual duties were 2 in number. He would give her, in due course, 2 sons, the necessary heirs to the dukedom. He would treat her with the formal respect a Vanderbilt heiress deserved in public. Beyond those 2 duties, he would live his own life. Consuelo, the Duke implied, would adjust. Consuelo did adjust. She had been raised by Alva to adjust to situations she had not chosen. Blenheim Palace, when she arrived in late November 1895, was already in a state of significant disrepair. The roof leaked. The windows whistled in winter. The library, the great Von Brugg long library that ran 200 feet along the south front, was unheated. The state apartments retained their 17th and 18th century furniture, but the carpets were threadbare, the silk wall coverings were faded, and the kitchens were Victorian. The Vanderbilt money began to flow into the palace from January 1896. The architect Achille Duchesne was hired to redesign the gardens. The contractor Trollope and Sons of London was hired to re-roof the south front. The interior designer Charles Allam was hired to update the principal state rooms. The combined budget for the first phase of the restoration, completed by 1898, was approximately £1 million, at the time roughly $5 million. A second phase, undertaken between 1904 and 1907, added another £400,000, roughly $2 million. By the time the work was complete, the palace had been saved from the slow decay that had threatened it. The work was the only unequivocal good thing the marriage produced for the historical record. Consuelo gave birth to John Albert William Spencer Churchill, the Marquis of Blandford, on the 18th of September, 1897, at Spencer House in London. She gave birth to Lord Ivor Charles Spencer Churchill on the 14th of October, 1898, also in London. Both deliveries were attended by Queen Victoria's accoucheur, Sir John Williams, an honor that the Queen had personally arranged. Both boys survived. Both grew up to be ordinary, decent, slightly damaged English gentlemen of the period. They were, in the language of the dukedom, the necessary heirs. The Duke maintained throughout the marriage a series of relationships with women of his own class. The most enduring was with Gladys Deacon, the American beauty whose mother, Florence Baldwin Deacon, had been at Consuelo's wedding. Gladys was, in the early 1900s, a celebrated society beauty in Paris and London. She was painted by Boldini. She was admired by the Proust generation in Paris. She had been first introduced to the Duke during the family's London season in the autumn of 1896. By the early 1900s, the relationship was an open secret. By 1906, it was a public scandal. Consuelo's response through these years was to do her duty without complaint. She entertained at Blenheim, she ran the household, she kept the staff, which at the height of the season numbered more than 60, including a butler, an under-butler, 3 footmen, 6 maids, a housekeeper, a cook, 3 kitchen maids, several gardeners, gamekeepers, grooms, and a stable hand. She received royalty. She presented at court. She did the season in London. She founded charitable organizations. She involved herself in social reform. She founded, in 1901, the Prison Aid Society for Women Former Prisoners. She joined the boards of several London hospitals. She became, by virtue of competence and consistent visible effort, one of the most respected duchesses in Edwardian England, despite the fact that her marriage was effectively over by the time her younger son was 3 years old. The internal calculation began, by her own later account, around 1904. The Duke's relationship with Gladys Deacon had become impossible to ignore. The household at Blenheim functioned, but the marriage at the center of it did not. Consuelo began quietly to think about a future in which she was not the Duchess of Marlborough. She did not consult Alva. She did not consult her father. She wrote to her brother, William Jr., in New York in March 1906. The letter, which survives in the Vanderbilt papers, contains the sentence that, in retrospect, marks the decision. She wrote that she would not, she thought, be able to remain at Blenheim after the boys went to Eton. The boys went to Eton in the autumn of 1906 and the autumn of 1907, respectively. Consuelo left Blenheim in October 1906. She did not announce her departure. She did not stage a confrontation. She simply moved her London household to Sunderland House, a property the Vanderbilt money had bought for her in Curzon Street, and informed the Duke, by letter, that she would not be returning to Blenheim. The Duke accepted the announcement, formally and with relief. Chapter 9. The departure that took 20 years to become an annulment. Consuelo left for London in October 1906 and never returned to Blenheim as Duchess, and that walk took 20 years to reach paper. The walk itself was simple. The signing of the documents that confirmed it took 2 decades. The reason was partly legal, partly social, and partly religious. Legally, English divorce law in 1906 required documented adultery, as in New York, but the prevailing partner could be either spouse. The Duke had no shortage of documented adultery in his history. Consuelo had none. Either party could have filed, neither did. The Duke did not file because he had no particular wish to remarry and no desire to expose his own conduct. Consuelo did not file because she had 2 young sons whose social position depended on the formal continuation of the Marlborough marriage and on the continuing connection of their father's family to their mother's money. Socially, the agreed separation of 1906 was treated in the English newspapers as the Duchess of Marlborough taking up residence in London for her health. The Duke continued his relationships in Northamptonshire and in Paris. Consuelo settled into Sunderland House, into her charity work, and into the formal duties she retained as Duchess of Marlborough, including the entertaining of foreign dignitaries who continued to be referred to her as the wife of the Duke. Religiously, the question was more delicate. The Duke had been raised Anglican. Consuelo had been raised Episcopal. Neither was Catholic. The young sons were Anglican. But the Duke, in 1927, was preparing to marry Gladys Deacon, who was Catholic. A Catholic marriage required, under canon law, that any prior marriage of either party be either dissolved by death or annulled by the Church. Consuelo, by the late 1920s, would also be preparing to marry, in her case, Jacques Balsan, a French Catholic aviator she had quietly come to love in the years after the separation. The civil divorce came first. In 1921, after 15 years of formal separation, Consuelo filed for divorce in the English courts on the documented ground of the Duke's adultery. The Duke did not contest. The decree was granted in November 1921. The financial settlement was minimal because the Vanderbilt money had already been transferred to the Duke under the 1895 wedding contract. The Marlborough family kept the money. Consuelo kept her own personal property, her London house, and her freedom. The annulment came 5 years later. In 1926, with the Duke planning to marry Gladys Deacon and Consuelo planning to marry Jacques Balsan, both parties petitioned the Roman Catholic Church for a declaration that their 1895 marriage had never, in the eyes of the Church, been valid. The hearing was conducted by the Sacred Roman Rota, the Catholic ecclesiastical court that handles such cases. The testimony was extensive. Consuelo testified, in writing, that she had been forced into the marriage by her mother. She testified about the locked room. She testified about the threat against Winthrop Rutherford. She testified that, on the wedding day, she had been in tears throughout the ceremony and had spoken her vows under duress. The lady's maid, then still living, gave corroborating testimony. Most remarkably, Alva Vanderbilt Belmont herself, then in her 70s and a leading figure in the American suffragist movement, gave written testimony confirming Consuelo's account in every material respect. Alva acknowledged that she had forced her daughter into the marriage. She said she had believed at the time that she was acting for her daughter's good. She said she now believed otherwise. The Sacred Roman Rota considered the evidence over several months. In 1926, the court issued its decision. The marriage of Consuelo Vanderbilt and the 9th Duke of Marlborough was declared null and void from the beginning on the ground that the bride had married under duress sufficient to invalidate her consent. The decision was the deepest moral repudiation possible inside the Catholic system. It said, in essence, that the marriage had never existed. The two sons were declared legitimate, as the law and the church both permitted. The Duke proceeded to marry Gladys Deacon in 1921 in a civil ceremony, and again in the church after the annulment, although that marriage too would not last. Consuelo married Jacques Balsan in a Catholic ceremony in 1921, and remained happily married to him until his death in 1956. The walk from Blenheim to the annulment had taken 20 years. The wedding contract had taken 12 weeks to negotiate. The annulment, in its careful canonical language, undid that contract not by erasing the money, which had already been spent, but by erasing the marriage that had cost it. Consuelo was, formally, no longer the Duchess of Marlborough. She had never, in the eyes of the Church, been the Duchess of Marlborough. The Sacred Roman Rota had agreed. Chapter 10. 3 Women Who Survived the System. By the spring of 1927, all 3 women were still standing, and all 3 of the men were not. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont was 74. She lived part of the year at Marble House in Newport, part of the year at her Paris apartment in the Rue de la Source, part of the year at the suffragist headquarters in Washington. Anna Gould, now Anna Talleyrand Périgord, was 51. She lived between the Hôtel de Talleyrand on the Place de la Concorde and the Château de Boursault in the Champagne country. Consuelo Vanderbilt, now Madame Balsan, was 50. She lived between Sunderland House in London, the Château de Luçois in the south of France, and the long, quiet afternoons of a marriage that, for the first time in her life, made her happy. William Kissam Vanderbilt had died in 1920 at 61. He had spent the last 2 decades of his life in Europe, mostly in Paris, in pleasant private retirement and with a quiet second wife. He had been outlived by his first wife by 12 years. Boni de Castellane was alive but socially diminished. He published his memoir in 1924 under the title L'art d'être pauvre, The Art of Being Poor. He died in 1932, in reduced circumstances, in a Paris apartment paid for by a sympathetic cousin. The 9th Duke of Marlborough was alive, but had been divorced twice. He would die in 1934, at 62. Survival for the 3 women had not been the same as triumph, but it had not been nothing. Alva, after the Belmont death in 1908, had moved into the suffragist movement with the full force of her organizational genius. She funded the National Woman's Party. She paid the rent on its Washington headquarters. She drafted the legal arguments that supported the 19th Amendment. After the amendment was ratified in 1920, She turned to the question of an equal rights amendment and was still working on the project at her death in 1933. Anna Talleyrand Perigord, after the divorce from Boni and the marriage to Healy, became one of the most respected American expatriate hostesses in Paris. She kept the Gould money intact for the next generation. She entertained intelligently. She did not give interviews. She supported the French Catholic charitable institutions associated with her new husband's family. When she died in 1961 at 86, the obituary in Le Figaro described her as the last representative in Paris of the great American houses of the late 19th century. Consuelo Vanderbilt Balsan, after the annulment, wrote her memoir. The Glitter and the Gold was published in 1952 when she was 75. The book is, in the genre of upper-class memoirs, unusually honest. It described the locked room. It described the tears at the altar. It described Blenheim, the Duke, the relationships, the long, slow walk to the annulment. It did not blame Alva more than the facts required. It did not excuse her either. The book sold continuously from 1952 and has never been out of print. Each woman, in old age, had completed something the wedding ceremony had not made possible. Alva had completed the work of becoming, in the eyes of the next generation, a public figure rather than a private wife. Anna had completed the work of running her father's fortune with greater skill than he had. Consuelo had completed the work of writing herself, in her own voice, into the historical record from which her marriage had nearly erased her. They were not, any of them, ordinary women. They were not heroines. They were three rich women who had, between them, paid a price the historical record can read in dollars and in years. The lesson the next generation took from their lives was not that women should marry. The lesson was that, when the marriage failed, a woman who knew her contract and kept her records could survive the failure and might, if she lived long enough, define what the failure had meant. Chapter 11. The cost. The settlements did not cover. A divorce settlement could buy a house, a school, a hospital, but not the years a woman had spent learning to disappear. The personal cost of the 3 divorces, measured in the currency the dollar figures could not register, was not in the historical record, but in the inner lives the women themselves rarely discussed. Alva and Consuelo did not speak to each other for nearly 20 years after the 1895 wedding. The estrangement was open. Alva, in her late writings, acknowledged that her decision to force the marriage had been wrong. Consuelo, in her memoir, accepted the apology gracefully, but did not pretend the wound had closed. The relationship between mother and daughter was, by the time both women were old, a working arrangement rather than a bond. They corresponded on practical matters. They saw each other at family events. They did not, by any account that survives, return to the closeness they had shared before the wedding. The relationship between Consuelo and her elder son John was strained by his closeness to his father at Blenheim. The relationship between Consuelo and her younger son Ivor was warmer, but complicated by his sense that his mother had not always understood his unhappy school days. The marriage to Jacques Balsan, by contrast, was uncomplicated. Consuelo described it, in her memoir, as the first easy relationship of her adult life. Anna's relationship with her 2 sons by Boni was strong. She had raised them in effect alone, with help from English governesses and her own family. They grew up bilingual, well-educated, and protective of their mother. Her second marriage to Élie de Talleyrand Perigord was, in the formal language of the Almanach de Gotha, more than satisfactory. In personal terms, it was a marriage of mutual respect rather than passion. Anna's later letters, which survive in the family papers, describe a life of contentment, work, and quiet routines. Alva's later years carried their own private grief. The Belmont marriage, which had been happy, ended in 1908 with Oliver Belmont's sudden death from peritonitis at the age of 49. Alva was 55. She was a widow for the second time. She did not remarry. She channeled her energy into the suffragist movement and into the building of the Belmont Chapel at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, where she would eventually be buried beside Belmont. The 3 women, in old age, exchanged occasional letters. The most poignant exchange survives in fragments. In 1928, Consuelo wrote to Anna, congratulating her on the marriage of her elder son to a French noblewoman. Anna replied with a short and warm letter and a photograph. There is no record of either woman having corresponded with the Duke or with Boni in the same period. The men were gone, in spirit if not yet in body. The women had outlasted them. The wider point is the one this channel returns to again and again. Wealth on this scale is a system. The women inside the system were as constrained by it as the housemaids who polished their silver. The constraint operated through different mechanisms, but the result, for any woman who tried to live a private life of her own choosing, was the same. The Gilded Age divorce was, at its heart, an attempt to step partly outside the system without losing the protection the system also offered. It was an attempt that worked more or less for these three women. It worked because they were rich enough to pay the price. What did they lose that the settlement did not cover? Time. Years of their 20s and 30s spent in marriages that nobody would have wished on a friend. Privacy. The columns and the divorce filings and the annulment hearings exposed parts of their lives that ordinary women, married happily or unhappily, were spared. Trust. None of the three, by the evidence of their later letters, ever again fully trusted the man who had married them first. Innocence. None of the three lived past the age of 30, believing that wealth would protect them. They all knew, by the time the divorce was final, that the protection of money was contingent and required active management. These are the costs the 8-line petition, the $400,000 party, and the $2,500,000 wedding contract did not register. They are the costs that the historical record, even at its best, can only sketch. They are the costs that the women themselves understood and did not discuss, because to discuss them would have been to admit they had paid them. Chapter 12. The Contract. You inherited without reading it. Every marriage in the Gilded Age was a contract, and the most important clauses were the ones nobody put on paper. The unwritten contract had governed the great American families for a generation. The husband took mistresses, the wife took silence, the family took control of the principal, the European title took the dowry, the children took whatever the system left. Alva Vanderbilt broke the first clause in 1895. Anna Gould broke it again in 1906, in French and on a larger financial scale. Consuelo Vanderbilt broke the silence permanently in 1926, when she testified that her mother had forced the marriage and the Catholic Church agreed with her. Each of the three women had a different reason. Alva broke it because her husband had finally embarrassed her in public. Anna broke it because her husband had finally threatened the principal. Consuelo broke it because her own children were old enough that she no longer needed the marriage to protect them. The reasons were different. The result was the same. The contract was not, after them, what it had been before them. The next generation of high society divorce in America borrowed the templates. Anne Morgan, the daughter of J.P. Morgan, never married, but she watched her older sister's marriage to Herbert Satterley with the calmer eye of a woman who had seen what marriage could cost. Doris Duke, born in 1912, the heiress to the tobacco fortune, would in her time divorce James Cromwell with a one-paragraph public statement and her attorney's practiced efficiency. Barbara Hutton, born in 1912, the Woolworth heiress, would marry and divorce 7 times, each settlement a footnote in the pattern Alva and Anna and Consuelo had drafted. The wider American legal system absorbed the changes more slowly. The Married Women's Property Acts, already on the books in most states by 1900, were strengthened in the decades that followed. The 19th Amendment, in part funded by Alva, gave women the vote in 1920. The slow reform of divorce law to include grounds other than adultery would not complete until the no-fault divorce movement of the late 1960s and early 70s. The story this channel has been telling sits at the start of that long arc, not at its end. What does any of this mean to you, watching this in 2026? It means that the unwritten contracts of marriage have not disappeared. They have changed. The clauses are different. The enforcement is different. The cost of breaking them, for most people, is now in lawyers' fees and shared custody and split retirement accounts rather than in cottages and dowries and Beech Creek Railway shares. But there are still unwritten clauses. There is still a calculation that gets made, often quietly, often privately, often without lawyers, when one person inside a marriage decides that the cost of staying has grown larger than the cost of leaving. Alva, Anna, and Consuelo did not free their daughters. They did not dismantle the system that produced their wealth. They did not, by their actions, end the dollar princess trade, which continued into 1914 and beyond. They did not reform American family law in any direct way. What they did do was demonstrate, on 3 separate stages and in 3 different legal systems, that the unwritten contract could be broken by a woman with enough money, enough nerve, and enough patience. They showed that survival was possible, that the social order could absorb the act of breaking, and that the women who took the step could live the rest of their lives on terms closer to their own. That demonstration is the legacy. It is not a perfect legacy. It applied only to women rich enough to afford lawyers and the loss of one household. It did not extend to the housemaids who washed the silk gowns the heiresses wore at their divorce hearings. It did nothing directly for the working-class women whose marriages were destroying them in the same years. But the demonstration mattered because every reform that came afterwards built on the precedent that the unwritten contract was, in fact, breakable. The 8-line petition Alva Vanderbilt signed in March 1895 was a quiet beginning. The annulment Consuelo Vanderbilt received in 1926 was a quiet end. Between them, a piece of the unwritten contract had been put on paper and then torn up by a Catholic ecclesiastical court. So, I want to leave you with a question. The contracts you have inherited, the ones nobody wrote down, the ones your family and your culture and your social setting hand to you when you reach adulthood, those contracts have clauses too. They are different from the clauses Alva and Anna and Consuelo inherited. They may be quieter, they may be gentler, but they are there. The interesting question is not whether you have inherited them. You have. The interesting question is which of them you have read, which of them you have chosen, and which of them you have, at some point in your own life, decided to break. If this story moved you, subscribe so the next one finds you when it goes live. And comment with one thing. Which of these 3 women, Alva, Anna, or Consuelo, do you think paid the highest price for her freedom, and why? I read every comment, and I will be looking for your answer.